3 days ago, the Sarati fleet had 32 ships. That number had felt insufficient even then. Standing in the operations room watching the Ket Dominion cross into Sarati home space with a force that their most optimistic projections had not prepared them for. 32 ships against what the Ket brought should have been a fighting chance. It should have been enough to hold the outer line long enough for reinforcements to be called and arrive and change the equation. The reinforcements never came. The outer line lasted 11 hours. Admiral Cale had spent the 3 days since doing the only thing left to do, which was run. Not retreat in the tactical sense. Not fall back to a defensible position while maintaining formation and preserving options. Run. Full speed. Emergency protocols. Every ship pushed to whatever its damaged drives could manage, heading away from Ket space in the only direction that had not yet been cut off. She had watched her fleet count drop from 32 to 28 on the first day, and from 28 to 19 on the second, and she had stood at her command station through both days without sitting down, because sitting down felt like accepting something she was not ready to accept. Now it was day 3, and she had 15 ships. 6 of them were running on emergency power, which meant their weapons were offline, and their shields were running at partial capacity, and their crews were doing everything that could be done with systems that were held together by damage control teams working in shifts around the clock and a collective refusal to acknowledge how bad the numbers actually were. 3 more had hull integrity warnings on their displays that the damage control teams had quietly stopped logging, not out of negligence, but out of practical understanding that logging a warning you cannot address serves no purpose except to make the record of your final hours more thorough. Cale knew about the warnings. She did not mention them. Behind her fleet, somewhere in the dark at a distance that her navigation officer had stopped reporting aloud, the Ket Dominion was closing. They were not rushing. They did not need to rush. The math was on their side in a way that rushing would only have complicated, and the Ket were not a force that made decisions based on anything except the math. They were methodical and patient and completely certain of the outcome, and that certainty was in some ways harder to face than anger would have been. Anger could be worked with. Certainty just waited. Cale stood at the center of her bridge and looked at her crew. She had commanded these people for 4 years. She knew their habits and their histories and the specific way each of them handled pressure. She knew which ones went quiet and which ones got louder and which ones channeled everything into focused, precise work as a way of not thinking about anything outside the task directly in front of them. She had seen them handle difficult situations before and had always found something in their faces to draw from when she needed it. What she saw now was different. It was not panic. Panic required belief that the situation could still deteriorate, that there were worse outcomes still available that needed to be prevented. What she saw was quieter than panic and harder to look at directly. It was a specific stillness that settles over people who have already run the numbers themselves and already know the answer and are not afraid anymore. Because fear requires uncertainty, and the uncertainty was gone. They were waiting, not impatiently, just waiting. The way you wait when you have done everything available to you, and the rest is no longer in your hands. She would not let them wait. She turned to her communications officer, a young male named Roy who had been at his station for 16 straight hours, and whose eyes showed it even though nothing else about his posture did. "Open every frequency we have," she said. "Military bands, civilian channels, emergency frequencies, diplomatic bands. Everything in our system. Open all of it." Roy turned to look at her slowly. He was not questioning the order. He was giving her the opportunity to hear it reflected back before he carried it out, the way a good officer does when command is unusual enough that confirmation feels appropriate. "Admiral," he said carefully, "the charts show nothing in this region for 40 light hours in any direction. There is no registered presence, no council outpost, no civilian traffic. No one is going to receive a transmission out here." "Open them anyway," Cale said. "All of them simultaneously. Broadcast our position, our situation, and our heading. Keep broadcasting until something responds." Roy held her gaze for 1 more second. Then he turned back to his station and began opening frequencies. The distress call went out across every band simultaneously. A Sarati fleet identification, a damage report, a position, a heading, and a simple statement of situation that did not dramatize or exaggerate because the facts required neither. A fleet of 15 damaged vessels fleeing an enemy force with no destination and no viable options, broadcasting into a region of space that every chart in the known galaxy agreed was completely and entirely empty. The bridge was quiet after the transmission went out, not the tense quiet of people waiting for something hopeful. The resigned quiet of people who have watched their commanding officer do the last available thing, and are now waiting for the last available thing to fail, so that the situation can arrive at its conclusion. Kale watched the response timer on Roy's station. 1 minute, 3 minutes, 6 minutes. She did not move from her position at the center of the bridge. She kept her hand still and her expression neutral, and she watched the timer and said nothing because there was nothing to say that would improve the situation, and she had too much respect for her crew to fill the silence with words that were only for her own comfort. 9 minutes. 10 minutes. At 11 minutes and 4 seconds, Roy's station lit up. He stared at it. He looked at it the way people look at something when their brain is telling them what they're seeing, but some other part of them is insisting on verification before accepting it. He ran a check, then another one. Then he turned around in his chair and looked at Kale with an expression she had never seen on his face before in 4 years. "Response incoming," he said. "Single source. Direct reply to our broadcast frequency." Kale crossed the bridge in 8 steps. She looked at Roy's screen herself because she needed to see it with her own eyes before she believed it. The response was in Sarati, not translated Sarati, not the slightly mechanical phrasing that translation software always produced regardless of how advanced it was. Fluent, natural, correctly structured Sarati spoken by a voice that was calm and clear and carried no urgency, no surprise, no hesitation of any kind. The voice of something that had received a transmission and considered it and decided on a response in the time it took most people to understand what they were hearing. The signal identified its origin simply. Earth. Nothing else. No species name, no council registration, no fleet identification. Just that single word attached to a set of coordinates that Kale looked at and then looked at Roy and saw immediately from his face that he had already checked the charts and already found the same thing she was about to find. Nothing. The coordinates pointed to a region that every galactic map in their database marked as unoccupied, uncharted, and empty of anything worth noting. A blank space between log systems that explorers had passed through and found unremarkable and moved on from, without leaving anything behind except the notation that there was nothing there. The voice from that empty space was waiting for a reply. Kale straightened up slowly. She looked at the coordinates one more time. She thought about the Keth fleet behind her and the 15 ships around her and the hull integrity warnings that nobody was logging anymore and the specific stillness on the faces of her crew that she had been looking at for the last 6 hours. Then she looked at Roy. "Set course," she said quietly. Roy entered the coordinates without asking any of the questions that were very clearly visible on his face. The Sarati fleet changed heading and moved toward a point in space that the map said was empty, following a voice that had no right to exist out here, because they had nothing else to follow, and because sometimes nothing else is exactly enough. The faster-than-light transition ended, and the Sarati fleet came back into normal space, and for a long moment nobody on any of the 15 ships did anything at all. Not because there was nothing to do, because what was in front of them required a moment that none of them had budgeted for, the specific kind of pause that happens when reality delivers something so far outside your existing framework that your brain needs a few extra seconds just to confirm that your eyes are working correctly. Kale stood at her viewport and looked at it and said nothing. The region of space that every galactic chart in their database had listed as empty, uncharted, and not where the second look was not empty. It had ships in it, not a small presence. Not a modest collection of vessels that a minor unregistered species might quietly maintain at the edge of known space while hoping nobody noticed. A fleet, a real one. The kind of fleet that you look at and immediately understand was not assembled recently or quickly or for any purpose other than the one it was very clearly assembled for. Kale's tactical officer, a steady, experienced officer named Beth who had spent 20 years reading ship formations and had learned not to show her reactions on her face, was showing her reaction on her face. The human ships were dark. Not dark the way a ship is dark when it is running on low power or hiding its profile. Dark as a design choice, as a fundamental philosophy, The hull's a deep flat color that absorbed light rather than reflecting it, and made the ships harder to read at distance in a way that was clearly intentional. They were big, not all of them equally. The formation contained vessels of different sizes, filling different roles in the way a serious military fleet is organized, but the average size was larger than anything the Serati fielded, and several of the vessels at the center of the formation were large enough that Kale's mind kept wanting to reclassify them as stations rather than ships. But it was not the size that stopped her. It was the design. Every species in the Galactic Registry built ships that reflected something about who they were. The Serati built ships with clean lines and efficient forms that spoke to their engineering pride. Council vessels had a ceremonial quality to them, an awareness of how they appeared that showed up in small decorative details, and proportions chosen for impression as much as function. Even the Keth, who were purely military in their thinking, built ships with an aggressive angular elegance that carried a kind of pride in it. The human ships had none of that. There were no decorative elements. No design choices that existed for any reason other than function. The weapon systems were not integrated cleanly into hull profile the way most species integrated them. Flush and streamlined. They were mounted where they were most effective, which in several cases meant they sat prominently on the hull surface in positions that made the ships look almost unfinished to eyes trained on other design traditions. Armor plating was thick and layered, and clearly the result of someone asking how much protection they could add before it became structurally counterproductive, and then adding that much. Every surface that could carry a weapon seemed to carry one. These ships had been designed by people who looked at every available option and asked one question about each of them. Does this help us fight? And if the answer was no, it was not included. Beth turned from her station to look at Kale and open her mouth, and then close it again, because she could not immediately find the words that matched what she was looking at. Kale understood. She felt the same way. A channel opened before she could reach for her own communications panel. It came in clean and clear on their primary frequency. No hailing request, no formal identification protocol. Just a direct open channel the way you open a channel to someone you have already identified and have been expecting to hear from. The voice was male, calm, and spoke Serati with a fluency that Kale had stopped finding surprising somewhere around the third word, and had simply accepted as one more thing about the situation that did not match any existing category. Admiral Kale. A brief pause, not uncertain, just a natural rhythm of someone who speaks carefully because they mean what they say. I'm Captain James Cole. You made it with more ships than I expected. That's a good sign. Kale looked at the formation in front of her, at the dark ships and the layered armor and the weapon mounts that covered every viable surface. She looked at the 15 damaged vessels of her own fleet sitting in formation around her, emergency power warning still blinking on 6 of them, hull integrity notices still running quietly on 3 more. Captain Cole, she said, what is this place? Safe, Cole said. For right now, that's the part that matters most. A short pause. Bring your ships in close. We have repair teams ready to go as soon as you dock. Your people need rest, and your ships need work, and both of those things are available here. Kale looked at Beth. Beth was already running passive scans on the human fleet with a focused expression she wore when she was trying to build a complete picture fast. She caught Kale's eye and gave a small, careful nod that meant the formation was not hostile in its positioning, and the weapon systems she could read were not active in a targeting configuration. You said in your transmission that you had a plan, Kale said to Cole. I do, Cole said. I would like to hear it. You will, Cole said, get your ships settled first. Get your crew some food and some sleep. Then come to my ship and we'll sit down and I'll walk you through everything. A brief pause. There's a lot to cover, and I want you thinking clearly when we talk about it. Kale considered pushing for more immediately. She was 3 days into a retreat with an enemy behind her, and the instinct to gather information as fast as possible was not easy to set aside. But she looked at her crew again, at the exhaustion that had settled into every face over 72 hours of running, at the damage report still scrolling quietly on her secondary display, and she understood that Cole was right in a way that her urgency was making her resist. Her people needed to stop moving, even for a few hours, even in a situation that still had a Keth fleet somewhere behind it. We will need to be quick about repairs, she said. We don't have a lot of time before. I know what's behind you, Cole said. His tone did not change. It stayed exactly as calm as it had been from the first word. I've been tracking the Keth fleet since before you made contact with us. I know their speed, their current position, and their projected arrival window. A pause that felt like the breath before something significant. That's part of the plan. Kale stood very still for a moment. She had commanded a fleet long enough to understand the difference between confidence that came from optimism and confidence that came from preparation. Optimism sounded like reassurance. It reached for comfort and offered freely because offering it cost nothing. Preparation sounded different. It was quieter, more specific, less interested in making you feel better, and more interested in making sure you understood the situation accurately. Cole sounded like preparation. She thought about the ships surrounding her, about the design philosophy built into every surface of every hull, about the weapon systems mounted for effectiveness rather than appearance, about the fact that this fleet existed in a region of space that nobody in the galaxy had ever thought to look at carefully, about the fact that they had been tracking the Keth before she even called. "We are coming aboard," she said. "Bay 3 on the central ship," Cole said. "I'll meet you there." The channel closed quietly. Kale turned to her crew and began giving the orders to bring the fleet in. Around her, the human ships held their positions without any adjustment, patient and dark and completely still, the way something is still when it doesn't know where it needs to be right now and knows exactly where it needs to be later. Beth appeared at her shoulder as the docking procedures began. "Their weapon count," Beth said quietly. She paused. "I stopped trying to get an accurate number." Kale looked at the formation one more time. "So did I," she said. The war room on Cole's flagship was smaller than Kale expected. She had commanded flagships herself and knew what the planning rooms of serious military vessels looked like. Large displays, multiple stations, room for senior staff to stand around the edges and contribute or observe. The general architecture of a space designed to make the people inside it feel like the scale of their decisions was being matched by the scale of their surroundings. Cole's war room had one table, one holographic display in the center of it, and 2 chairs. He was already sitting in one of them when she arrived. No staff present, no senior officers standing by to contribute their assessments, no one else in the room at all. Just Cole with a cup of something warm in front of him and a holographic display running a quiet loop of what Kale recognized as Keth fleet movement data, and a particular atmosphere of a room where the preparation had already been completed, and what remained was simply the conversation. Kale sat down. She had expected charts showing escape routes, defensive formations, safe corridors leading away from Keth space toward Council territory where the political situation could be managed and reinforcements could theoretically be requested and the Serati fleet could rebuild over time into something viable again. The kind of plan that a careful species produces when it finds itself unexpectedly involved in someone else's war and wants to be helpful without becoming a target. Cole reached forward and adjusted the holographic display. What appeared above the table was not an escape route. It was a corridor of space approximately 4 light hours long and 2 light hours wide, positioned between 2 unremarkable star systems that Kale did not immediately recognize. The display showed it in detail that suggested extensive prior survey work, every gravitational feature mapped, every approach vector plotted, every sight line and sensor shadow cataloged with the thoroughness of people who had spent real time preparing the specific location for a specific purpose. Marked throughout the corridor, in positions that Kale's tactical mind immediately began assessing, were the locations of the human fleet. Not at one end of the corridor, not in a defensive line across the middle. Throughout it, at intervals and angles that covered every approach vector and every possible response formation, positioned with the kind of care that comes from running the scenario many times and finding the configuration that left the fewest available answers. Cole began walking her through it without any introduction or preamble, pointing to positions on the display with a calm, steady manner that Kale found herself paying close attention to, not because the plan required dramatic presentation, but because the absence of drama was itself informative. He was not trying to sell her on this. He was explaining something that was already decided in his mind, and that he was now sharing with her as a matter of practical necessity. The Serati fleet would enter the corridor from a near end and hold position at the far end. Damaged, slow, visible. Exactly what the Keth expected to find at the conclusion of a 3-day chase. The Keth would follow them in because the Keth had spent 200 years operating on the assumption that the space they moved through contained only what their intelligence told them it contained, and their intelligence had never once told them that a species nobody had registered was sitting in the dark in a region nobody had charted with a fleet that nobody knew about. The human fleet would already be in position inside the corridor before the Keth arrived. They would not be visible. They would be waiting. Kale studied the display for a long time without speaking. She traced the Keth approach vector with her eyes and followed it to the point where the corridor's geometry meant the Keth fleet would be fully committed before any repositioning was tactically viable. She looked at the human ship positions and the coverage angles and the overlapping fields that meant any attempt to reform or retreat would be addressed from multiple directions simultaneously. She looked at the position assigned to her own fleet at the far end, visible and apparently exhausted, and understood exactly what role the Sorati were being asked to play and exactly how much genuine danger that role involved. "My ships will be in real danger during the approach phase," she said. "Yes," Cole said. He did not add anything to it. No qualification, no reassurance, no suggestion that the danger was manageable or that her ships would be well protected during that phase. Just a direct confirmation of something they both already knew, because the display made it obvious. Kale appreciated that more than reassurance would have given her. "If your timing is wrong by even a small margin," she said, "my fleet is engaging the Keth alone before your ships are in position." "That's correct. And if that happens—" "It won't happen," Cole said. His tone did not change in the way a tone changes when someone is trying to sound more confident than they are. It stayed exactly the same because it was not a performance. "The timing is not the variable I'm concerned about." Kale looked at him directly. "You sound certain." Cole picked up his cup and held it without drinking from it. He looked at the display for a moment before answering. Not because he was considering what to say, but in the way people look at something familiar when they are about to explain it to someone for the first time and are deciding where to begin. "We have been watching the Keth for a long time," he said. "Not casually, not the way you watch something you are aware of, the way you watch something you are specifically studying. Their tactical patterns, their command decision frameworks, the assumptions that sit underneath how they assess a situation and choose a response." He paused. "The Keth are very good at what they do. They have been the most dangerous military force in this region of the galaxy for 2 centuries, and that is a real and earned reputation. But they have one consistent vulnerability that 2 centuries of success has made much worse." Kale waited. "They cannot imagine being trapped?" Cole said simply. "Not because they lack intelligence. Because nothing in their entire military history has ever given them a reason to develop that particular imagination. Every species they have ever engaged either ran or fought in the open or surrendered. Nobody has ever been in a position to do anything else." He set the cup down. "We have been in that position for quite a while. We have been waiting for the right moment to use it." The room was quiet for a moment. Kale looked at the display again, at the corridor and the positions and the Keth approach vector that led straight into the center of something that had been built specifically around the way the Keth thought and moved and made decisions. "How long have you been out here?" she asked. Cole told her. He told her in the same quiet, unhurried voice he used for everything. And Kale had asked the question expecting an answer that would be interesting, and had not expected an answer that would make her stop asking follow-up questions and simply listen. He told her about the choice, the specific deliberate choice made a long time ago by people who had looked at the galaxy clearly and understood what it did to species that arrived before they were ready. He told her about the years of watching and mapping and learning before building, and the years of building that followed, and the patience required to do all of it in silence while the galaxy continued operating on the assumption that the space humanity occupied was empty and unremarkable and not worth a second look. He told her how long. When he finished, Kale sat with it for a moment. She thought about the dark ships outside, about the weapon mounts and the armor plating and the detailed survey data built into the corridor display, about the Keth fleet movement patterns running in the background of the display loop, data that had clearly been collected over a period far longer than any immediate crisis response would explain, about the fact that they had been tracking the Keth before she called. "If this goes wrong," she said quietly, "there is no second attempt. My fleet does not survive a direct engagement with what is behind us, not in our current condition. No, Cole said. And you understand that? Yes. And you are still certain? Cole looked at her steadily. I have run this a great many times, he said. The corridor, the positions, the Keth response patterns, the timing at every phase. I have looked for the version where it goes wrong, and I cannot find it if we execute correctly. A brief pause. We will execute correctly. Kale looked at the display one final time. At her 15 ships marked at the far end of the corridor, damaged and visible, playing the role of fleet that had run out of options. At the human positions marked throughout the corridor that those same ships would be luring the Keth into. At the approach vector that led the most feared military force in this region of the galaxy straight into the center of something built entirely around the one thing they had never learned to consider. She thought about the 3 days behind her, about the ships she had lost, and the crew members who had not made it to this conversation, and the specific stillness she had seen on the faces of the people who had. She thought about what she had come here with and what she had found in the voice on the channel that had spoken Serati perfectly from a point in space the maps said was empty. She looked at Cole. When do we start? She said. Cole reached forward and adjusted the display to the preparation phase layout. We already have, he said. The waiting was the hardest part. Kale had been in combat enough times to know that the minutes before an engagement were their own particular kind of difficult, different from the engagement itself, and in some ways harder to manage. During a fight, your mind had specific things to do, and the doing of them filled the space where fear would otherwise sit. Before a fight, there was nothing to fill that space except the awareness of what was coming, and the knowledge that the timeline was no longer in your hands. Her fleet held position at the far end of the corridor exactly as Cole had placed them. 15 ships, damaged and visible, running just enough power to look like what they were supposed to look like. A fleet that had run out of corridor and run out of options, and had nowhere left to go. The positioning had been Cole's instruction, and it was accurate in ways that made Kale uncomfortable because it required her ships to look defeated, and looking defeated required presenting exactly the profile that the Keth would be most eager to close on. Beth was at her station running quiet, passive scans on the corridor behind them, watching for the transition signatures that would mean the Keth had arrived. She had been doing it for 2 hours without being asked to stop or rest. Nobody on the bridge had suggested she stop. The corridor behind them was the only thing anyone on the bridge was thinking about, and having someone watching it carefully was the closest thing available to comfort. Kale stood at her command position and kept her breathing steady and thought about the human ships sitting invisible throughout the corridor. She could not see them. Her sensors could not find them, which she had tested quietly during the preparation phase, and which had told her something significant about what human cloaking technology was capable of. She knew the positions from Cole's display, but knowing the positions intellectually and feeling the reality of ships being present in space where her instruments showed nothing were two different experiences, and her instincts kept wanting to treat the corridor as empty no matter what her memory told her. She understood now why the Keth would make the same mistake. Beth's voice came quietly across the bridge. Transition signatures. Corridor entrance. Multiple contacts. Kale looked at her display. 34 Keth warships came out of faster-than-light travel at the near end of the corridor in a formation that spoke directly to 200 years of successful military engagement. Clean, confident, the spacing between ships precise in a way that comes from crews who have practiced their formation entries enough times that it happens without conscious coordination. They were fully powered, fully operational, every system active and ready in a way that contrasted with the damaged Serati fleet at the far end of the corridor, the way a new blade contrasts with a bent one. They were also exactly the number Cole had projected to within 2 ships. Kale watched them on her display and felt the specific quality of the moment settle over the bridge. Her crew had gone completely still in a way they had gone still 3 days ago when the math had stopped being useful, but this stillness was different. That one had been resignation. This one was something she recognized from a long time ago, from early in her career before the wars had accumulated their weight, from moments when a plan was in motion, and all that remained was to hold your position and trust the work. The Keth commander did not slow down. That was the thing Kale kept coming back to as she watched the formation advance through the corridor on her display. He did not call for a sensor sweep of the corridor before entering it. He did not reduce speed to allow his forward elements to assess the approach before the main body committed. He came in at full advance speed with his entire fleet, in a tight pursuit formation designed for closing on a damaged enemy at the end of the chase. And he kept that speed and that formation as he moved deeper into the corridor, because nothing in 200 years of operational experience had ever given him a reason to do anything different. The corridor looked empty. It had always looked empty to anyone who looked at it without knowing what was there, and the Keth commander had no reason to know what was there, and so the corridor looked empty to him, and he advanced. His lead ships were 2/3 of the way down the corridor length when the first human vessel decloaked. It appeared off the port side of the Keth formation without any of the visual indicators that most cloaking systems produced on deactivation. No shimmer, no energy surge, no gradual materialization. Simply not there and then there, a dark, heavy ship sitting at close range to the Keth formation in a position that had clearly been chosen with specific attention to the coverage angles it provided. Kale watched the Keth formation on her display and saw the slight irregularity in their movement. That meant the lead ships had registered the contact, and the information was traveling back through command chain. Then the second human ship appeared on the starboard side. Then 3 more at various points along the corridor's length, each one materializing in sequence, each one in a position that the display showed Kale had been marked in Cole's planning session. Then more, appearing throughout the corridor in the spaces between Keth ships and around the edges of the formation and ahead of the lead elements, each appearance adding one more piece to a picture that was assembling itself around the Keth commander in real time, whether he wanted it to or not. The Keth formation's movement became less regular, not chaotic. The Keth were too well trained for chaos, but the clean, precise spacing of a confident pursuit formation began showing the small hesitations and micro-adjustments of ships whose commanders were receiving new information and trying to incorporate it into a tactical picture that had not been designed to accommodate it. The corridor was not empty. It had not been empty when they entered it. It had not been empty for a considerable time before they entered it. The entire length of it, every approach angle and every response vector and every position that a military commander would instinctively want to move toward when a formation needed to reform under pressure, had been considered and addressed and occupied before the Keth fleet had dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the entrance. They had sailed into the center of it at full speed, without slowing. Cole's voice came across the open channel. Kale heard it on her bridge speakers at the same moment the Keth commander was hearing it on his. The same calm, unhurried tone that had not changed from the first word he had spoken to her. "You've come a long way," Cole said. "This is where it ends." Kale put her hands flat on her console and kept them there. What followed did not feel like a battle in the way battles had felt in her experience. Battles had a back-and-forth quality to them, an exchange of pressure and response, moments where one side gained something and the other side adjusted, and the outcome remained genuinely uncertain for long enough that the people inside it could feel the uncertainty in a physical way. This did not have that quality. The human ships had been placed in those positions because those positions removed every viable response before the response could be formed. Every direction the Keth formation could move toward had been considered and addressed. Every reformation option created a new problem before it solved the existing one. The Keth commander was making decisions, real tactical decisions by a real and capable military mind, and each decision was being met by something that had been waiting for exactly that decision since before he arrived. Kale watched her display and said nothing. Her crew said nothing. Beth sat at her station with her hands still and her eyes on her screen, and the focused expression of someone witnessing something they want to remember accurately. 19 minutes after Cole's voice came across the channel, the corridor was quiet. Kale looked at her display for a long moment. She looked at the space where 34 Keth warships had been, and at the human fleet now visible throughout the corridor, and at the readouts showing her own 15 ships still intact at the far end, and she tried to find the right way to process what she had just watched happen around her. She could not find it. The scale of it was too large and too fast and too complete to fit into any category her experience had built. The Keth fleet was not retreating. There was no reformation happening at the corridor entrance, no surviving elements pulling back to regroup at a safe distance. The fleet that had chased her for 3 days and destroyed half the Sarati Home Defense Force in less than 2 weeks was simply gone, and the silence it had left behind had a weight to it that kept making her mind expect something more to follow. Nothing followed. Cole's channel opened. "Admiral Kale." His voice was the same. Exactly the same as it had been in the war room, and on the initial transmission, and through the entire 19 minutes. Are your ships intact? Kale looked at her damage displays. Her hands were not entirely steady as she checked each readout, and she noticed this and did not try to correct it because some responses were simply honest. Everything was intact. Every ship, every system, every crew member, exactly as Cole had said the timing would ensure. Yes, she said, we're intact. A brief pause from Cole's end. Not surprise. Something quieter than surprise. Good, he said. Take your time. Kale stood at her command position in the sudden quiet of a corridor that held 34 Keth warships 19 minutes ago, and looked at the dark human ships visible throughout it, and understood something that she suspected the rest of the galaxy was going to spend a considerable amount of time understanding. Humanity had not answered her distress call because they happened to be nearby. They had answered it because they had been ready for it. The corridor was quiet for a long time after it ended. Kale did not open any channels immediately. She did not call Cole or request a status update or begin the practical conversations that needed to happen about what came next. She stood at her command position and let the quiet sit for a while because her crew needed it, and because she needed it, and because some moments deserve more than a few seconds before you move past them. Beth had leaned back in her chair and was staring at her screen with the expression of someone whose mind was still running through what it had just recorded and finding the same result every time. The rest of the bridge crew had similar expressions in various forms. Not the stunned blankness of people who had experienced something traumatic, something more considered than that. The look of people who had watched something happen that was going to take a while to fully understand and who were already beginning that process in real time. Kale let them have the hour. She used it herself. She walked the ship quietly, checking in with damage control teams and medical staff, and the engineering crews who had kept 6 emergency power vessels running through 3 days of retreat and a combat engagement, and were now finally getting the news that they did not have to keep running anymore. She spoke to her crew not as an admiral making rounds, but as someone who had been in the same corridor with them and understood what the last 72 hours had cost, and wanted them to know she understood. By the time she returned to the bridge, the initial shock had settled into something more functional. Stations were being manned properly again. Reports were being filed. The ordinary machinery of a fleet returning to operational routine was running, quietly and steadily, which was the most reliable sign she knew that people were going to be all right. She sat down at her command station. She had prepared questions during the hour. Real ones, important ones, the kind that needed answers before any planning for what came next would begin. Where could the Sorati fleet go now that their home system was gone? What council resources were available and how quickly they could be accessed? What the political situation looked like in the sectors adjacent to former Sorati space, and whether any of them represented viable options for resettlement or rebuilding. She had organized the questions carefully in the order they needed to be addressed, the way she organized everything, because organization was how she moved forward when forward was the only available direction. She opened the channel to Cole. His voice came through immediately, which meant he had been available and waiting without making her feel like he was waiting, which she noticed and filed away as one more small data point about how he operated. She opened her mouth to ask the first prepared question. She heard herself ask a different one entirely. How long have you been out here watching? The words came out before the prepared list had any input into the matter, rising from somewhere underneath the practical questions, from the place where the thing that actually needed to be understood had been sitting quietly for 3 days waiting for the right moment to surface. Not how many ships did humanity have. Not what were their intentions toward council space. Not any of the strategically important questions that an admiral with a destroyed home system should reasonably be prioritizing. Just that one. Cole was quiet for a moment on the other end. Not the pause of someone who had not expected a question, or who was deciding whether to answer it. The pause of someone who knew exactly where the answer began, and was taking a second to find the right starting point. Then he told her. He started further back than she expected. He told her about the early period, when humanity had first developed the capability to reach beyond their own system, and had begun to understand what the galaxy actually looked like up close rather than from a distance. He told her about what they had seen, and what those observations had taught them about the patterns that played out repeatedly across the galaxy, the same patterns in different forms, Different species and different centuries, but the same fundamental dynamic running underneath all of it. New arrivals who announced themselves before they were ready, before they understood the landscape they were stepping into, before they had developed the capability to defend what they were placing at risk by being known. The outcomes of those announcements were not always immediately catastrophic, but they were consistent in the long run in ways that patient observation made very clear. Humanity had looked at that pattern and made a decision, not a rush decision, not a fearful one, a deliberate, considered, collectively reached decision that took time and debate and the kind of difficult, honest conversation that only happens when the people having are willing to set aside what they want in the short term and think clearly about what actually serves them in the long term. The decision was simple in its statement and enormously demanding in its execution. Learn first, build second, be known when you are ready and not before. They had pulled back from the edges of explored space. They had removed every trace of their presence from registries and charts and the peripheral records that other species kept without necessarily meaning to. They had found the uncharted regions, the blank spaces on galactic maps that nobody had ever thought were worth looking at carefully. And they had gone there and stayed there and begun the long, patient work of becoming something that could stand in the galaxy on its own terms. Cole described the building years without dwelling on them, the infrastructure that went up in dark space, the fleet that took shape over decades, the systems of observation and intelligence gathering that allowed them to watch everything happening in the known galaxy without being seen watching it. He described the way they monitored frequencies that other species use for distress calls and emergency broadcasts, not because they were waiting for a specific call, but because they understood that the moment they were waiting for would most likely arrive through exactly that channel. Someone desperate enough to broadcast into empty space on every frequency simultaneously was someone who had run out of every other option. He described the Keth specifically, how long humanity had been watching them, mapping their tactical patterns, studying the assumptions embedded in how they moved and decided and engaged. He described the corridor, how long it had been prepared and maintained, how many times the engagement scenario had been run and refined and run again. He described the specific threshold they had set for themselves, the conditions that would need to be present before they used it, and how those conditions had finally appeared 3 days ago when a Serati distress call came in on a monitored frequency from a fleet with nowhere left to run. When he finished, Kale did not speak immediately. She sat with everything he had told her and let it settle into the spaces alongside everything she had already experienced over the past 3 days. The voice from empty space. The dark fleet in the uncharted region. The war room with 2 chairs. The corridor and the 19 minutes and the quiet that followed. It all fit together now in a way that made complete sense, and that she somehow found more remarkable for making complete sense, because the patience required to build something this large and this capable and keep it entirely invisible to a galaxy that had been actively operating all around it was not the kind of patience that fit easily into any framework she had for how civilizations behaved. She sat with it for a long moment. Then she asked the question, not because she suspected the answer was something she needed to guard against. She had moved past that somewhere in the corridor during the 19 minutes. She asked it because it was the honest next question, and because Cole had been honest with her throughout, and the conversation deserved the same quality from her end. "What do you want in return?" she said. The pause from Cole's end was short. "Nothing," he said. Cale waited for the rest of it. The qualification, the diplomatic framing, the reasonable and understandable list of things that a species who had just destroyed the primary fleet of the most feared military force in the region might reasonably expect in exchange for that service. Nothing came. "That is not a complete answer," she said carefully. "It is," Cole said. His voice had the same quality it always had. Settled, not performing certainty, but simply possessing it. "We did not answer your call because we needed something from the Serati. We answered it because you needed help, and we were in a position to provide it, and those 2 things together were sufficient reason." A brief pause. "That is the whole answer." Cale thought about the dark ships and the years of preparation, and the corridor built for exactly this purpose, and a species that had spent an extraordinary length of time watching a galaxy that did not know they existed. "You built all of this," she said quietly, "and you are not going to use it for anything except helping people who call. We are going to use it for whatever it needs to be used for." Cole said, right now it needed to be used for this. The news reached the Galactic Council over the following days in fragments and pieces, arriving through Serati diplomatic channels, and recovered Keth sensor data and the accounts of 3 Keth vessels that had been outside the corridor and had survived by distance, and had very little useful information to offer except the fact of what they had witnessed from far away. A species without a registry entry, without a council seat, without a single diplomatic record in any active database. A species that the galaxy had simply never thought to look for because the space they occupied had never seemed worth looking at. That species had ended the Keth Dominion's primary fleet in 19 minutes. Council chambers went quiet in a specific way. They go quiet when the framework everyone has been operating inside it turns out to have a very large thing in it that nobody had accounted for. Intelligence services began searching uncharted regions with a thoroughness that had never previously been applied to spaces the maps called empty. They found more than they expected to find, and less than everything that was there, and in the dark space between registered systems, in the places that the maps still called empty because the maps had not been updated, and would not be updated until humanity decided the time for that had arrived. Cole's fleet went back to its positions and its routines and its patient ongoing work of watching a galaxy that was only now beginning to understand it had never been alone out here. The distress frequencies stayed open. They always had been,